working groups, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg Group, and Trilateral Commission throughout the 20th century. In more recent history, the long-held beliefs of the ruling class regarding control of the individual's body by the undermining of his mental abilities were then furthered by the technological breakthroughs of the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 19th century, the Prussian government conducted research into the study of how to make individuals compliant cogs in the machine of their conflict-based empire. Prussian psychologist Wilhelm Wundt determined that the individual human being has no soul and can thus be programmed like an automaton or robot.
You see, the social engineers don't need us under social Darwinism. We're scum to be removed. We are seen as nothing but biological androids or replicants from the Philip K. Dick book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, turned into Blade Runner. We're just seen as dumbed down biological workers.
When individual identity has been forsaken, it is much easier to compartmentalize the minds of those being controlled. Various personages throughout history have described the human being as a machine, but it was the synergy amongst the work of Wilhelm Wundt, Ivan Pavlov, and many others, which scientifically quantified the individual as soulless, thus justifying manipulation to plunder individuals of their rights, transforming individuals into human resources.
Our system is copied from a 1819 Prussian system that's a three-tiered education system. One tier is for the intellectual elite. The second tier is for the servers of the intellectual elite. They would be the professionals, the doctors, the lawyers. And the last tier is for the lay. It's for the masses.
Education, as we know it, is nothing more than mind control. It is the science of control. And the British scientists, the eugenicists, came up with systems to dumb people down and make them submissive. But the German model, in fact, namely the Prussian model, that was designed to create soldiers that were owned by the state, but that were so brainwashed they were proud to go off and march into musket fire. That system, known as kindergarten, is the whole basis of modern Western education.
How do you measure the achievement of a nation?
If you want to know how we're really doing, take a look at our schools. For on what we're doing here and in schools throughout the world rests not only our future fate, but perhaps the very fate of civilization itself.
Building upon this dehumanization of individuals to the animal state of stimulus response, Russian researcher Ivan Pavlov and American researcher John B. Watson conducted experiments based on classical conditioning, a simple manipulation of reflexes under observable conditions. These methods were then improved and perfected by Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner.
B.F. Skinner was also one of these famous American behaviorists, and he championed something called operant conditioning. Again, just a fancy jargon term for some basic common sense. And operant conditioning was really all about negative reinforcements like timeouts, positive reinforcements like food pellets and money, and punishments, which are like punishment, shocks. This operant conditioning doesn't work so good on anti-authoritarians, people who challenge and resist authority. And later on, research has shown that operant conditioning works best on people who are dependent, infantilized, in other words, made like children.
When you ask yourself, as a teacher, as I have at the college level, what have I got that my students want? It's sometimes a pretty discouraging question, but you can discover things which will be reinforcing to students at any level. And that has been done. A great deal of progress has been made. There are things in an ordinary, even say a ghetto classroom, lower grades or high school, that can be used as reinforcers. You can have special foods at lunchtime, access to play space, privileges to associate with other kids of your choice. More and more of these things have been brought into play as the kinds of contrived reinforcers that can be used temporarily to get the kinds of behavior which will then eventually have their own natural consequences, which will be reinforcing.
One of the notable things that separates human beings from other inhabitants of this planet that we call animals is our ability to form questions. And that allows us to remove ourselves from certain types of control. Now, animals are subject to many of the same sort of stimuli that can train and condition them to give you, you can make a pigeon, according to Skinner, that appears to know how to read and respond to lexicons. So it gives the appearance that the pigeon can read or that the fleas are trained, but really all you're doing is, reinforcing a random schedule of conditioning, taking natural characteristics and harnessing them. So what you see in the 20th century, not only with the eugenics crowd and all these other things that we've talked about, what you see is they go after the root cause of humanity. The root cause of humanity is that we've learned to, speak amongst ourselves, and we've learned to observe reality, remove contradictions, and get to that which exists. When somebody obscures that feedback loop between you observing and testing it out and verifying it, when someone obscures that, they can take total control of your awareness.
These methods of classical conditioning had advocates in other fields equally or more influential. Soon, the field of compulsory education would teem with the ideas first spelled by these social engineers.
These children are being taught to accept uncritically whatever they're told. Questions are not encouraged.
How can you ask such a question? Have you got a textbook?
Yes, ma'am.
Does it say here that our law courts are always just?
Yes, ma'am.
Then how dare you question the fact? Sit down.
And so we aren't surprised when...
But it must be true. I saw it in this book right here.
The education our children are going to get has nothing to do with education. It is training our children to be resources, human resources, that's the way they refer to us, to spin off profits for the globalists.
The greatest barrier to discovery is not ignorance. It's the illusion of knowledge, and that's what the 15,000 hours in compulsory schooling really entrains and conditions into us, is that you've been told this story of the people in South America, and so you think you know about it. And it's not until later in life when you might come across more information about conquistadors and how Jesuits infiltrated all the religious systems and took all the riches out and basically harvested this whole area. This is an example of plunder in South America that went on for hundreds of years. So until you have this other piece of information to bring this into focus, you think that what you were taught in public schooling during that 15,000 hours is really what's going on. And it's not until you bump up against reality, as George Orwell said, usually on a battlefield, that you have to consider that which you were taught to believe versus the objective evidence that exists.
John Taylor Gatto was an award-winning educator in New York who took kids that couldn't even read or write, were headed for prison, and made them top-level students. And then he discovered that he was shut down by the big tax-free foundations so that he couldn't teach the children this information. And he discovered that it was by design that they were dumbing people down to make them subservient biological androids or replicants. That's what we're seen as. But now we're obsolete. We're to be phased out the new robotic systems, the drone aircraft, the drone submarines, the drone ships, the drone robots on the ground. We're all being conditioned, all being acclimated for this.
In The Underground History of American Education, John Taylor Gatto details how, beginning in the early 19th century, American travelers abroad were writing on the methodology of Prussian schools and composing travelers' reports, which were very influential on educational techniques in the United States. However, in 1831, it was French philosopher and Minister of Education Victor Cousin who published his Report on the State of Public Instruction in Prussia. which not only led to the consolidation of French schools under the Prussian model, but also directly influenced reformers like Horace Mann in the United States to follow suit. Mann traveled to Prussia and, without even seeing one classroom in session, sought to adopt the Prussian model of education with his annual reports given to the Massachusetts State Board of Education. Mann's promotion of the concept that the state is the father of children was reinforced and expanded by educational reformers throughout the 19th and 20th century.
When we speak about enculturated processes, when we talk about the imprinting, of course, I mentioned educators. One of the things that surprises a lot of people, and it shouldn't because it's publicly known, is that our education system is not about educating as much as it is about socializing. Like the duckling in the chicken yard. If you take that duckling and raise it with the chickens, it's going to be imprinted, it's going to behave like the chickens. And in that very real sense, we perpetuate this. The danger is we don't just perpetuate it, we don't just enculturate it, but it's the only sane way we see to raise our children. And the result is there's no escaping it.
C.S. Lewis said, when training, which is Skinner, Pavlov, beats education, civilization dies.
Although education has proven to be highly effective in controlling human behavior, more intensive research would need to be conducted away from the prying eyes of the public.
The Tavistock Institute was set up by the British Empire to really study mind control and to scientifically drill down into human behavior and put in textbook form systems of basic control so that could be duplicated out to government and corporate entities. And Tavistock has been involved at every level of social engineering.
The Tavistock Clinic was founded in 1920 and operated as part of the Psychological Warfare Division of the British military. It was initially a voluntary outpatient clinic for treatment and research and was made up of general physicians, neurologists, and psychiatrists to facilitate the treatment of neurosis and shell-shocked British soldiers returning home from World War I.
Going through their own publications on Amazon, you can find that some of their books cost like $18,000, $20,000. And what that tells me is they don't want the average person to be anywhere near getting their hands on this book, because what it gives you inside those books is the teacher's edition, to use an abstraction, as opposed to the students sitting around the class not knowing what the answers to the questions are. There's a group of people who are being given the answers to all the questions about how we act, react, and how we've been understimulated with curiosity in order to make us more subordinative.
You could say much of our world today is the world of the Tavistock Institute and Edward Bernays.
Having been instrumental in the Tavistock Clinic and director of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, it was former officer and consulting psychiatrist to the British Army, John Rawlings Rees, who created the concept of the psychological shock troops, or culture warriors, a federation of psychiatrists, which he intended to disperse across the globe to make it, quote, possible for people of every social group to have treatment when they need it, even when they do not wish it, without it being necessary to invoke law. The Tavistock Institute's influence did not stop simply at social psychology. Kurt Lewin, former head of Britain's Psychological Warfare Bureau, was a German refugee who became the founder of modern social psychology in the 20th century, an early consultant to the OSS, and an influential researcher with the Tavistock Institute in the area of management thinking and action research, specifically focused on the tactics of managing change within society. No organization of the size and scope of Tavistock can operate for long without ample funding. From whom is that funding derived? Certainly no small part comes from the seemingly benign, tax-exempt foundations of the global elite.
I was researching the Reese Committee back in like 1952, 1953, where they went in and investigated major foundations and some of their subversive activities. These foundations put an enormous amount of energy into controlling what is being taught at the schools and how it's being taught, and preparing, using schools basically to indoctrinate children to accept their station in life, to accept a collectivist future.
According to Dr. Lily Kay, whose expertise was demonstrated in her 1993 book, The Molecular Vision of Life, the Rockefeller Foundation, Caltech, and the New Molecular Biology, the world in which we are living has been molded, shaped, and continues to be directed by an elite establishment of eugenicists, a ruling class fueled by violating the will of others to attain their goals.
Nowadays, almost every adult agrees on one basic goal for all students.
Schools ought to turn out good citizens.
Yes, good citizens.
That's right. Absolutely. This country always needs good citizens.
The real goal was to change America from an individualist system into a collectivist system, and in which case it could be merged with the rest of the world, and there would be this great new world order that we hear so much about in recent years.
The purpose of creating tax-exempt foundations was not just to collect more money, but to invisibly assert influence over the power centers which control the programming of individuals, specifically to breed the self-reliance out of individuals and prepare them for the collectivist lifestyle planned by the ruling class. Their goal: to undermine personal liberty on biological, social, and economic levels.
They came together and decided what they were going to do with this money was to gain control of education in America, not for a philanthropic purpose, but to change the thinking of the American people over a generation or two.
The globalist social engineers hungered and desired and coveted the power that the liberty in the U.S. had created. They wanted to take it over, and the tax-free foundations wanted to use it as an engine of global domination, and they've done that. And the Reese committees were the only time when Congress stood up constitutionally and demanded all the big foundations come and testify and open their private books. And the Rockefeller, the Carnegie, the Ford Foundation, they all came and said, look, we're here under presidential directive from more than 50 years ago. We've been told to collectivize the United States, to merge it with the Soviet Union. We've been told to make America more compatible with authoritarian regimes, and we're just doing what we were chartered to do.
Until the creation of language, brute force held the key to fear, and thus to the control of individuals through violence and physical aggression. With the innovation of language, the minds of individuals could be harnessed with ideas and beliefs, making less significant the physical dominance of previous generations. This is how, for example, men of small stature could keep otherwise brave and ferocious gladiators as household slaves, whose deaths could be used for profit and entertainment. Out of the ashes of World War II rose the specter of human experimentation in the form of the 1939 to 1945 exodus of Nazi intelligentsia to continue their research and experimentation under the protection of national security. After being denazified, they were given new identities to live among those against whom they had fought.
We brought Werner von Braun over here and several other scientists, including those that were involved in concentration camp medical experiments, including mind control experiments.
A lot of these guys were, as far as the State Department was concerned, war criminals. They were linked directly to the Nazis and therefore couldn't get visas, couldn't come into the United States. So the CIA set up this series of programs to route everybody around the State Department visa requirements, get them into the country.
Everybody knows about the race at the end of World War II to get Nazi scientists. The Russians wanted them, the United States and England wanted them. And the United States and England got most of them because the Nazis didn't want to go to the Soviet Union, another authoritarian system. They wanted to go to a, quote, freer system. And like an infection, they came to England, Canada, and the United States. And it wasn't just over NASA and rocketry with Wernher von Braun and Goddard and others. It was tens of thousands in mind control and torture and military science and surveillance. And the CIA got modeled to a great extent off of the Gestapo. And so we see really the evil of the Nazis being transplanted back to the United States and England, where the eugenics philosophy that they had embraced had originally sprung.
The Office of Strategic Services, the precursor of the CIA, under the direction of William Wild Bill Donovan and Allen Dulles, recruited Nazi scientists and aided their importation into America. Among them were rocket scientist Wernher von Braun and the aeronautical physician Hubertus Strughold.
The problem that the United States was facing was there was all these German scientists who were kind of in the wind, loose, wasn't clear where they were going to end up. And the French, the British, the Russians, and the Americans were all trying to recruit them.
The Germans had developed lots of different advanced weapons. And they'd also done a lot of experimentation on human beings in the concentration camps. So they had a lot of medical data that we didn't have. They had, of course, the rocket scientists and the airplane scientists and all of the rest of it. And Paperclip was our version of going into Europe and finding these guys and bringing them to the United States to work.
What we're missing in the documentation, we have physicians, aerospace medicine people, film people, ball bearings, projectile experts, all kinds of scientists. We're missing from the story the psychiatrists. But there must have been psychiatrists brought over, in parallel to Strughold under Paperclip.
German financing came from America, came from Wall Street, and came from American corporations. Even the political support that Hitler got in Germany was, to some extent, traceable to American influences. Prior to World War II, American financiers, banks, corporations, all decided that there was money to be made in pre-war Germany. After all, they all knew that Germany was preparing to become a military aggressor, and it needed money to construct vehicles of war. They were spending a lot of money designing and building tanks and airplanes and military carriers and things like that, submarines, ships, and there was money to be made. And so Wall Street and some of the largest corporations like AT&T and even Ford Motor Company got very much involved with the Nazi regime.
The experiment that went on became known as Nazi Germany starts in World War I and the Versailles Treaty in Paris 1919, basically giving the Germans the short end of the stick, giving them war reparations that they can't possibly pay, totally unrealistic. Now, this famous German banker named Hjalmar Schacht gets together with a guy from the Bank of England named Montague Norman, and they create something in 1932 called the Bank for International Settlements. And they use this as a clearinghouse for all the national debts, but really it's being used to launder money. What you find then is that same group, Hjalmar Schacht, becomes Hitler's banker. So Hitler is totally financed by these people who are making their lives out of pulling the wool over other people's eyes. And at the same time, they want to have the National Socialist experiment to test out the Prussian education system that they're using and about to roll out all over the world.
Following the 1945 completion of Operation Paperclip, the CIA created MK-Ultra, a top-secret mind control research project, which was managed by Sidney Gottlieb under the direction of Allen Dulles. The program began in the early 1950s, was officially sanctioned in 1953, and officially terminated in 1973. The program engaged in many illegal, unethical, and immoral activities. In particular, it used unwitting US and Canadian citizens as its test subjects, which led to controversy regarding its legitimacy. MK Ultra involved the pioneering of many methodologies to manipulate individuals' mental states and alter brain functions, including the surreptitious administration of psychoactive drugs and other chemicals, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and other various forms of torture.
When I interviewed John Marks about Search for the Manchurian Candidate, he said a very interesting thing to me. He had been given 10 boxes of CIA information on a Freedom of Information Act request, not his first. He had been trying to get this kind of information on the mind control program of the CIA in the 50s, 1950s, for a long time.